My name's Clayton Georges. I grew up in the docks and the Bay Area of Cardiff. I was born in the 50s, so I grew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s. And my heritage in terms of my parents and when my parents were born, my mum was born in this country and her father was from Africa, her mother was from this country. My dad is from St. Lucia. His father was a St. Lucian, his grandfather was an African from South Africa, and his mum was from India. My earliest memory is being at my grandmother's farm in Shrewsbury as probably a 3-year-old. And I remember that she had a pig called Bessie that used to tunnel under the fences, and I was fascinated by the farmyard and the spiral staircase in her house. Fine, I was brought up in the docks area of Cardiff. There was only 2 black families in the area, but it was a very good community. No racial problems in there, apart from a neighbour who lived next door who didn't like a black family living next to her, but she was the only one and we didn't really have any bother from her at all. There was a little rhyme that my dad used to sing about playing marbles from St. Lucia, and another one he used to talk about just walking, but his sort of memoirs of St. Lucia was of a beautiful island, but also he was a member of the Monty Black gang, which is a gang of young boys. What they actually did or how they got together, I'm not really sure. Living in such a small community, I remember going over to Grangetown, which is about a 2-mile walk from where we lived, and we were actually a bunch of kids playing on the roofs, running around, jumping up and down on the roofs, and I thought, well, I'm over here, no one will know. But then the next day my dad asked me what I was doing. Someone had obviously seen me, recognized me, and reported back to my dad. We used to build dens. We used to climb the old cranes and run in and out of the old buildings. And there was a building which we got into that was just full of foam. One room was full of foam. So all we used to do was dive off the ledge into the foam. Wouldn't damage anything, but we would just play there for hours. The other thing, the haulage firm that I mentioned earlier, they had a lot of lorries packed in their yard, and the lorries might be 3 or 4 foot between each lorry. So what we used to do is climb on top of the lorries and jump across from each one, or even sometimes undo the tarpaulins and climb underneath the tarpaulins and hide under there. Another game we used to play was chicken, and that was where you laid down in the street and waited till a car come along and see who was the last one to actually get up. It might sound dangerous, but in those days you could wait 10 minutes for a car and never see a car, so it's not busy like today. And obviously the car would be 100 yards away and you'd get up. I went to Eleanor Street County Primary School, I should have gone to the Catholic school in Pomeroy Street, because my dad was a Catholic and I should have been baptized as a Catholic. But at the time, the canal, which is now the Canal Park, went from the seafront all the way up to town, and there was a rickety bridge across the canal, and my dad didn't want my mum walking across that bridge, because at the time I should have gone to school. She was pregnant with my sister, so he said it was okay for me to go to the school, which is Eleanor Street School, which actually backed onto our house. So it was something like a 2-minute walk around the corner, and that's the school that I went to. That was primarily, or before I went there, it was a boarding school, but when I actually went, it was just an ordinary school. And I have fond memories of the school. I remember one of the headmistress, Miss Gresham, quite a very stern lady, and then the headmaster, Mr. Jones, who was quite progressive, and Mr. Wickham, who was an ex-badminton champion. So he taught us to play badminton to quite a high level, and we could never beat him. Primarily, I'd say 98% white. You had quite a cultural mix. You had Norwegian family, you had Spanish families. In the area, there was a Russian family as well. So we had quite a diverse culture in the docks area. So the junior school was Eleanor Street School, and that was fine. Went to Ninian Park School, so there were boys from Grangetown that I would have known, and boys from the docks. And then when Fitzallen was built, we went to Fitzallen School. So again, there were guys that I grew up with from the docks in Grangetown, but met new friends as well. As a family, we all chipped in, and I remember my mum teaching me to cook and teaching me to iron when I was 7 years old. And her attitude was, I want to teach you as many of the life skills as I can so you can grow up to be independent. And today I tell people that, and they think, oh, right, that's strange. But it was about not using you, but actually training you for life. I can't remember things that I had to do, but if I was up early in the morning, then I'd light the fire. So chopping sticks and bringing coal in and lighting the fire in the morning, and perhaps if you were first there, cooking some porridge for everyone in the morning, those sort of things. But they weren't rigid things. You just helped out in whatever needed to be done at home. Well, I remember. I've got three brothers and 2 sisters. My father's friend, who we called Uncle, lived with us. And I always remember my uncle from Liverpool coming to visit us, and many of my father's friends from London would come to visit him from time to time. It was very close, and he had lots of connections throughout Cardiff, London and Liverpool. My cousins were at the early part of my life living in Shrewsbury and Liverpool. So it was rare to actually see my cousins, but certainly my uncle from Liverpool used to visit us. Taught, no, but you just sort of grew up with a very strong respect of older people. And in particular, my mother's friends up in the Bay, friends of hers, we always called them auntie or uncle. And I have a strong connection now with people that were my mother's good friends, in particularly my godmother, who was Rita Phillips's mother. So it's her mother, and I still have a strong connection with Rita now. Oh, things don't come to mind, but I remember my father having a saying for everything, and my children tell me that I have a saying for everything. And I was amazed when I met my father's father how many different sayings he had, but nothing comes to mind at this moment in time. Storytelling, no, but telling of stories of their life, and particularly my dad's time in the Merchant Navy. He talked about that. No, I'm not really. I never had really strong experience of a negative attitude in the community in which I lived. I just felt accepted. It was moving outside of Cardiff into the valleys that there was a lot of racism and negative attitudes. One of the things that I used to do at the end of our street was a haulage firm. And in the summer, I'd go out with the drivers, help them load the lorry, help them unload. And I remember going up to Pontypridd, and there were people who were looking at me and making comments. This was attributable to my colour and my race. I just felt they were idiots. Wow, okay. In the docks area, we lived on the street that went onto the estuary. So very often when the tide was out, we'd go playing in the mud and end up filthy. Have to come back home and clean our shoes, clean our clothes, and then have a bath. Over the waterfront there was the jetty where St David's Hotel is now. There was an old jetty there. So we used to actually, when the tide was coming in, we'd be jumping and diving off the jetty, and we'd swim out to the buoys. I remember one day we were dive bombing off the jetty, seeing who could make the biggest splash. And 2 of the lads decided to piggyback and jump in together. And obviously they made the biggest splash. But the one at the bottom got stuck in the mud. So the top one floated up, but the bottom one stayed, and we were a bit concerned. until after a few seconds he wriggled out of the mud and floated up. You got hit. Yeah. My dad was semi-skilled, and he always wanted me to learn a trade. And he said, if you learn a trade, you can travel anywhere in the world. And I became an electrical engineer. The electrical engineering was in business. My involvement in the community was as wanting to give something back and help the youngsters. And I suppose one of the major things was the karate school that we run in Butte Town, and also being involved in the Brutan Carnival. As a teenager, going out, playing darts, the old Big Windsor pub. We used to play darts in the Big Windsor, and sometimes we'd be there till 4 o'clock in the morning playing darts. When it was strange, around midnight there'd be a tap on the window, and the door would be opened, and in would come the policemen off their shift, and they'd join us for a game of darts and a pint. So we shouldn't have been there, but no one really bothered. No trouble was caused. Very strong, cohesive community, and very cosmopolitan community. You had the Norwegian church, you had the Greek church, you had the Baptist church, you had St. Stephen's, you had the mosques, and from a religious aspect there were lots of different religions, but none of the divisions that we find today. And some of the older people recount the stories of when they were young. Their religion depended on the time of year. So whatever religion had a food festival, they were of that religion. So they'd go into the mosque and eat the food, and they'd say it was lovely to be able to sit on the floor and eat with your hands, rather than have to sit at a table and eat with a knife and fork. And then the Christian festivals, they would be into those as well. And I remember the Whitsun Treats as a young boy. The community really got together, and the mums would organise the day trips. And what we would do is, one of the lorries from the haulage firm, the drivers would take one of the lorries with the permission of the owner, who'd say, yeah, that's fine. Get the benches from the back of the church and put the benches on the back of a flatbed lorry, put the sides up, and you'd all sit on the benches, and you'd travel out to Lantwy Major or someone, and no one ever fell off. No, I went to St. Stephen's, served on the altar and was in the choir, and to the Gospel Hall that was at the bottom of Bute Street by the pier head. So I didn't really have much experience of other diverse religions. You just sort of took it in your stride. You never saw them as different. You understood that people had different cultures, but there was an overall acceptance of different people. You noticed the common things between you as human beings rather than the differences. People expect people to be like them anyway, but I'm an individual, and I say you have to accept me as the individual that I am. So no, there's not pressure. I never felt that I've had to behave in it or act in any particular way. I've just been myself. Okay, my first job experience, I was still in school, and I worked in David Printers, and it was an after-school job and a Saturday morning job. So I helped clean up the workshop. As a printing firm, they delivered printing to a lot of the local businesses. So it was my job to take the sack truck with whatever had been printed and deliver it to the local businesses and get a receipt, take things to the post office, parcels or letters, and make sure those were posted. So that's my first experience of work, and that was a very good experience. I was the only black boy in the firm, working part-time, but from the owner to the guys who were doing the printing, very helpful and very willing to explain the printing process and the different printing machines. So I learnt a lot from them as well. Following that, I got a job as an apprentice electrical engineer. There was one other black guy in the firm, but again, I got on well with everyone in the firm. My first job was on Newport Telephone Exchange, doing the electrical wiring on that. Okay, in school I never passed an exam. Out of school I never failed an exam. And I look back and say the way they taught in school was not conducive to my way of learning. I went on to do my electrical engineering up to HNC level. Then joined British Telecom and got a HNC in telecommunications, diploma in financial management accounting. I've never stopped learning, and I'm still continuing to learn now. So I have the ability and the capacity to learn, but in school it just was not compatible with the way they taught. One of the things that I was involved with was the Brutan Karate Club, and I was a Welsh international along with a few other of my colleagues. So we represented Wales at junior and senior level, but then we passed that on to other younger members of the community. And many years later, a lot of them said, well, do you realise how that helped us? And they said we were, to them, positive role models. We had faith in them and confidence in them. When the school was telling them that they were failures and never would amount to anything, we were telling them the converse, that they were strong people, that they could succeed. And I remember some people saying that the ones who trained karate, the younger men, went on to college and university and get really successful jobs. The ones who didn't were the ones that were bitten by the bug of crime, shall we say. And their lives have been totally different to the ones who had the discipline, the support, the camaraderie, and the confidence that we instilled in them. Short experience when I was young, working with the haulage firm, not working, but being taken out by the haulage firm. The others as an electrical engineer, can't really say that I came across much discrimination, because I think I was quite a younger, stronger man in those days. And in the work environment, it was a very strong team working environment. Didn't get much hassle at all. I think it's made me a strong, independent, determined man, and a strong sense of community as well, helping others and working with others. I think that comes from my cultural heritage and background. To my own local community, the docks and the bay has been regenerated, but the Brutan area is still very much isolated. So it's not just a social isolation, but an economic isolation as well. You've got restaurants and pubs in the bay, but sometimes it's out of the economic pockets of the local community. And also it's not felt as though it's our community. Whereas the pubs and the clubs evolved and they grew organically. When you impose a new situation in a community, it tends to be quite isolating and disruptive to the community. And not a lot of the local people have benefited from all the developments. Many years ago, when the bay was being redeveloped, we actually as a community got together with the county council and said, what can actually be done about this regeneration so that local people can benefit? Because at the time there was a young lad from the bay who was training as a town planner, and he'd studied what had actually happened to the communities in the docklands of London, and we realised that there were dangers happening in this as well. The county council said, well, what we'll try and do is incorporate local people, or at least give local people the opportunity to gain employment during all this redevelopment, but it never really happened. Cardiff Bay Development Corporation sort of ticked the box for engaging the community by having people in on meetings, but didn't really take account. And I think the chap who was the head was ex-military, so very much his attitude was, I'm at the top, I will dictate what's actually going on, and I have to be listened to rather than listen to other people. So I think they had the wrong man in place. It wasn't someone that could build bridges and forge links with the community, so that permeated throughout the organisation. Okay, when I was younger, there was very tremendous respect for people's differences. I think now the differences are highlighted, and it has split the community in some respects. There are very strong demarcation lines, whereas before there wasn't. Even though you were of a different culture and you might have spoken a different language, we were all Tiger Bay people or Docks people, and that's not the same anymore. One of the major things was the redevelopment. Where we lived, our house was compulsory purchased, and we were forced to move out of the community that we'd actually lived in. There was a lot of redevelopment of housing, and I don't know if you're aware of the redevelopment around Alice Street, particularly the housing on the park side. Well, that's been demolished and rebuilt. You had the flats that were brought in Loudon Square. It was in the 60s, and that was what people actually thought would benefit the community. But I think a lot of the regeneration or the destruction of the old houses, and in particular in the Bay and the Docks, whereas in other parts of Cardiff, they actually regenerated those houses. They did projects that actually rebuilt the houses rather than demolish and move people out. So that demolishing split the community. And when people were moved to Llanedin and Ely with the promise that when houses were built, they'd come back, but very few ever did. As a young person, you had grandchildren, children, parents, and grandparents. You had that strong connection throughout the generations. That has been lost. I would say that was a reverse of the colonial things that the British did going out and creating the empire. So those links were created to Britain, and people did that in reverse. Well, we have a link to Britain, so let's come to Britain. And I think a lot of the impressions were that some of the streets in the UK were paved with gold, that everything was fine. And when people got here and found some of the housing situations and the racism that they encountered, things were quite different. Well, my dad left St. Lucia when he was 14, and he was a cook's assistant on a three-masted sailing ship, so that takes you back some time. And he was a seaman most of his life until he settled down in the UK. But travelling the world, going to various European countries, Brazil, Africa, and I exactly don't know how his journey to the UK, how he ended up, but it must have been through the seafaring route, as a lot of other West Indians and Africans did. Their journey around the world ended up in the UK. I think it's reflecting Cardiff in isolation, but it's not taken citywide as a whole. And I think there could be more done to reflect the diversity. One of the things I'll take you back to is the Brutan Carnival. In its heyday, it was very diverse and multicultural. The events that have taken that over, the big weekend, are a different format. It's not of the community. It's something that the establishment is actually presenting to the community as what it thinks, whereas the carnival grew out of what the community wanted, and it was enjoyed by people throughout Cardiff and people outside of Cardiff as well. Okay. You have to then look at where the city fathers, the ones who control the organisation, where they come from, and the makeup of those individuals.
Okay.
I don't know what their reasons might be, other than perhaps it's not their direct cultural heritage. Until you get people of diverse races and cultures in positions of influence, then I don't think that's going to filter down into the city. I have grandchildren. Four of my grandchildren live in London. My other grandchildren live in Cardiff. But for me, it's about sharing my experiences with them and encouraging them to be the best that they can, and really enjoying the time that I spend with my grandchildren. No, I don't engage with storytelling, but I will tell them stories about my life and my experiences, which enrich their life. And again, it's focusing on encouraging them to develop and grow to be the best that they can be. Tai Chi is my main thing, and that's my hobby and my life. And it's about studying, learning, and working. And I enjoy the outdoors. I'm part of a group called Diversity Outdoors, and our aim is to get BME people out of the city and into the national parks. So we have a strong link with the Pembrokeshire Coast National Park, and we're organising trips and events for BME people into those areas. Because even though some BME people may have travelled from Africa and from India, they've travelled thousands of miles, when you actually take them to these areas, they're actually amazed that such diverse and beautiful countryside exists in Wales. The communities still seem to be very isolated and stuck within the cities. Raising awareness. A lot of people say, well, we had no idea that this existed. Overcoming the cultural barriers of isolation, where people stick to a small community because they're afraid in some instances of what's outside of their comfort zone. So it's taking them outside of that comfort zone and letting them know. There are social economical factors as well. So if we raise money, we can help people overcome those things. Oh, I gave up karate actively in 1989, so that was a long time ago. I moved more into Tai Chi. So Tai Chi is not competitive. It's about my own personal mental, physical and spiritual development, whereas karate was quite competitive. And I think the highest achievement was a silver medal in the European Championships as part of the Welsh team. One of the things that I found growing up was the police had a negative attitude towards young black males, and I'm talking about my children and their peers. So very often we had to have a strong intervention to the police and say, look, you are actually picking on these young lads. If they've done something wrong, then by all means they will be punished. But you've got a suspicion and you've got a preconceived idea that because they're black and perhaps hanging around in a gang, that they're going to look for trouble or they're going to make trouble, or when something goes wrong, you immediately want to focus on a few people within the community, and you're aware of what happened to Cardiff 3. Okay, throughout the years I've had a connection through the community with the police through the Brutan Carnival, and I remember that we did a sponsored walk from Cardiff to London, and we were very strongly supported by the police, and I have high praise of the community police, but there has been an attitude within the police from some quarters that the community policemen are not real policemen because they're connecting with the community. So until you get that attitude going right the way through up to the top. Another instance, there was a woman who ran a Caribbean restaurant in West Bute Street. There was an incident where two men were actually fighting and broke her window. She contacted the police. The police came down, had a chat with the two people and let them off. And she complained, sort of got nowhere. But fortunately she had two sons in Newport who were in the police. So they picked it up and they dealt with it. So I would not have known what would have happened had her sons not been policemen, because the police attitude was, it's a Caribbean cafe, it's a black woman, something's happened, we'll just let it go. Yes, there is institutionalized racism. In my current role as BME Mental Health Advocacy Coordinator, I'm speaking to people who speak to GPs and health professionals. And in some instances, those health professionals have a preconceived idea of someone of a particular religious faith or from a particular culture. And rather than listen to that person and take consideration of that person's needs as an individual, they have preconceived ideas and in some cases are writing the support plan to that person before they've actually listened to that person's needs. Ooh, the docks, and the docks as the industrial area of the docks, the number of ships that used to come in and out of the docks, and in particular the decline of the docks. Every New Year's Eve you'd hear all the hooters of and the horns of the ships ringing in the new year, and I remember one year there was absolute silence. No ships were in the area at all, and that was like, wow, a tremendous change. And I think we had more freedom to do things. As young people, summer holidays, we'd grab a tent and some food and we'd leave home and go camping. No mobile phones. We didn't have a phone at home, so we basically had to fend for ourselves. And we did, and we felt quite safe and secure. I think there's a difference in the whole of the society nowadays. Not had much knowledge of indigenous English because I've sort of lived in Wales, but what I would say is that even going back to my childhood, there were many Welsh people from the valleys who came to Cardiff and the Bay, and because of their experiences and their mixing with different cultures, they had a different attitude to those who were isolated. And I think it's not knowing and not sharing and not being involved, not experiencing, that's caused some of the differences, the strong cultural diversity. Again, I've only ever lived in Cardiff, so I don't really have direct experience of other parts of the UK. Other than some of the attitudes of the police to young black people, then no. In my youth, there was a strong community and very many community meeting places, where it was a community centre, the local pub. People were involved in activities. You had the Kayaks Rugby Club, you had the Karate Club I mentioned earlier. You had places where people would go and share music. Because of the changes in Cardiff, those community places are not as strong as they once were. Well, the Brutan Community Centre, you've got a brand new up-to-date building with a lot of facilities in there. But a community centre, if it doesn't have the community, is just an empty building. So it's about the community working in that centre and working together. The pavilion, I haven't actually been in the pavilion, but the reports I get back are that it's again a really nice, up-to-date, modern building. And the Buzz Centre incorporates the health centre and meeting rooms and a cinema for the community. The major problem in the three areas is lack of parking. No, not at all. And I think a lot of people really appreciate, accept and enjoy the different cultural foods that are available. Not with the respect that they used to. The younger people seem to have a lack of respect for the elder generation. And I think sometimes with crime, the elder people tend to be picked on as being vulnerable. Yet when I was growing up, the elders were respected and protected and cared for. I think it's part of the whole social fabric of the country. Throughout the older Welsh communities, the old were respected and cared for. And I think it's more of a every man for himself community these days. But there's still some strong areas where people are still a community. For me personally, no, but I can tell you that there's a strong difference between Bristol and Cardiff. You'll find black people in a variety of employment opportunities in Bristol, and you won't in Cardiff. You can go through St David's Centre, and there's not a strong mix of black people. You've got organisations, building societies where you'll find there's not many black people. It is difficult for black people or ethnic people in general to find employment in Cardiff. It's down to the institutions and their attitudes. And again, it's the people in those institutions having such a strong inherent background of it needs to be us that's in control. I'll talk about St Lucia. I remember going there with my dad as a young man. I was 21 and he'd left when he was 14, so it's probably 35 years since he'd been to the island, and he was amazed how things had changed. And he talked about the self-sufficiency of the island when he was a young boy, how all the produces were local, and how now so much had been imported from America and it become very westernized. So there were strong changes, and of course you got a lot of the hotels and tourism, so there was a lot of buildings on land that sometimes open, and that's reflected in Cardiff. I particularly remember as a young man there was a great open space between Cardiff and Newport. Now there's so much development that the open spaces have gone. I visited St Fagans, and it's very much White Welsh culture. And it's strange how some of the people in St Fagans, because they speak Welsh, they invariably have a totally different attitude to people who don't speak Welsh. And I think that's a very isolationist view. The Story Museum, I've had no experience of that. Brutan History and Arts Museum, I've had a lot of experience of the Brutan History and Arts, but I think they could do more to involve the local community and reflect the local community history. It's archived, but it needs to be brought out more to the forefront. I think if they reflected more of the local history, they'd have a greater involvement from the local community. So it's there in the community, but it's not as connected to community as it should or could be. One of the first things that could be done is more exhibitions in the Brutan History and Arts Centre of the local community and the wider diverse community within Cardiff at a level that's appreciative to local people and not always at an academic level, which suits academics and professionals, but sort of tends to move away from local people. I think perhaps something could be done in the Cardiff Central Museum as well, more information in the libraries, and perhaps an exhibition of some sort or events of some sort in St Fagans that reflect the diversity of the cultures within Cardiff. It's part of the Welsh heritage. We've been here for hundreds of years. By having things that draw them into those museums, and also by raising awareness. Very often there are events going on in the community that the wider community is not aware of. So maybe perhaps local radio or the local press could be more used to help people raise awareness.